So hello and welcome to this special Tapestry and FSF podcast with me, Jules and Suma Din. And I'll leave Suma to introduce herself. Hi, Suma.
Hi, Jules. Thanks very much for having me on this. It's a pleasure again to talk to you and to your viewers. Yep, so I work in adult education, in family learning, and I write research in the area of education, especially in terms of minoritized parent engagement and that rather broad area.
Yeah. And Suma, you and I met because we've just recently done a Tapestry Education Conference about reflecting on parental engagement, and you were one of our speakers. And so we're just here today to carry on the conversation from your presentation there, really, and to talk about one of the mums. Do you want to say a little bit about the sort of the research or the lead up to the three mums that you spoke to for the presentation?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So a few years back, I researched mothers through focus groups and interviews across England, across ethnicities and backgrounds, about their experience with the school system, the state school system. So that was really useful in terms of seeing where they were coming from, what they think about education, and, you know, different areas that they've been involved in as well as challenged by. So it's quite broad brush. And for the conference, we kind of carried that on, and I interviewed three mothers, focusing on the early years and looking at what their experience was. Again, keeping it broad so that they actually tell their stories rather than pigeonholing their answers. And so they could speak about how they found the curriculum, how they found the big step of putting their children into the education system at nursery and then reception, and also how they support them, if they support them, or what they even think about it, because that's where it starts, isn't it? How we actually perceive our child's education and well-being. So both things came up in a variety of ways from all three parents, because it's always a unique experience that parents have.
Yeah. Just before we kind of begin talking a bit more about Mum C, because we're here today specifically to talk a bit more about Mum C's narrative, I just wanted to say that in your presentation for the conference, you had something that really was very powerful for me, was an image of a classroom door, and then I think the heading of the slide was on the other side of the door. And I just thought that was a really good reflective point to begin our conversation here about just that you know, that there's that space the other side of the door, and how do you get into that space, how do you cross into that space, but also how do you welcome people into that space.
Yeah, I just found that symbol of the doors, it spoke to me as well. I think all the way through the education system, parents can often feel like something different's going on there, something really unknown, and there might be a bit of mystique around it. Even if they want to know and they want to support, as we found with the moms that I talked to, there can be that disconnect because one's an institution with laws and rules and regulations and policies and paid professionals, and the other is home, which we all know is the first learning ground, and it's the first place where hopefully children feel secure and their well-being and learning are all kind of in one. So yeah, the door was really about, there can seem to be a barrier between the two, but really both parents and educators want the same thing, which is the best for the child that passes through the door.
Yes, of course.
Because it's not the parents going through the door, and it's not the teachers necessarily having the time to be on the other side of the door, though I know many do engage in the way they can. But yeah, it's about, I think, any research that I've done, and I think lots of people do, it's about leaving the door open and getting parents and teachers to see what each other's doing, because that's when the true partnership happens, through an open door.
Yeah, absolutely. And with Mum C, shall we begin by talking, because Mum C kind of spoke, didn't she, about that real desire to be involved with her child's learning, her children's learning, which was actually a common theme through the mums. Suma, do you have a little bit you could read out about what Mum C said about?
Yeah, sure. I'll just have to peer over this way a bit.
Yeah.
But yes, so I'll sort of summarize a little bit and read a bit. So she'd say, when my son was in nursery, I'd ask him what he did, and he wouldn't tell me much. And I wanted to do the things he was doing, as I think it's part of what I should do. And if he did tell me something, like he did this game, I would look things up and do something like that. And then she continues talking about how she actually used the school website as a place to find out. So quite a proactive mum there, who wanted to find out about what the education system teaches at nursery level, because this mum is of Somali ethnicity but came from Denmark to England, to part of London, when she was about 13 years old. So her early learning was all in a different part of Europe, and a different register, multiple languages going on as well, which I know isn't the main focus, because we're going to look at parent engagement. But I thought that was, just a really interesting way she wanted to assert that she wanted to find out how things are done here, and put the effort into looking things up.
Yeah, and then she goes on, I think, doesn't she, to say about how she just wasn't sure how to approach teachers to find out more about that, or about how her child was doing, which I thought was really interesting, in terms of just reflecting on how what you said about keeping the door open and kind of having that understanding between the home learning and the school learning, and how can educators just try to make that themselves and that space a bit more approachable and easier to kind of get a handle on.
Yeah, it's something that I found all three mothers actually said, that we don't know when it's right to ask. Do we wait for parents' evening, or do we, and that disjunct in their mind between education as in the curriculum, and well-being as in, is my child just happy? Because they're very young, aren't they? Nursery could be like the 2, 3, 4, and then 5 at roughly around reception, 4 and 5. So their well-being is probably their priority. It is their priority, but it's like, if I talk to a school, does it have to be curriculum only, and therefore should it be a parents' evening? So that came through with Mum C as well, about wanting to know about well-being. And I realised as the interview went on why well-being mattered more for this particular mum, because she'd already experienced sort of the unfortunate experience of her child being picked on and being really unhappy in one particular school, and then her moving him to another one where he thrived and did a lot better in himself. So they are really intertwined. And
there was a bit around when you were talking about the well-being and learning with Mum C as well, and she says something very powerful, Suma, doesn't she, which feels like a very small thing, but actually felt very important, about how you can feel when people really want to know how you are. Could you read that little bit out, Suma? Have you got that bit?
Yeah. Yes, I have that at hand. And this is, again, coming back to how she changed from one reception class in one school to another. So as a backdrop to what I'm about to read. So she's talking about the new class now. This reception class is his second one. And here there's a bit more face-to-face interaction when the school opened back. The teachers are much better. They're more interested, and they'll ask me about the baby and things like that. She has a baby, and you can feel it. That you can feel they want to talk to you. And sometimes we talk about the homework he gets on a Friday, things like that. But the old school last year, his reception class was different. And then she continued talking about the problems he had, and just the fact that she felt at that school there wasn't really that genuine desire to talk, even if it's just a little bit, but to really break the ice with her as a parent. I won't generalize, but she felt, and her own valid experience, that where the there was a genuine desire to engage, just asking something as small as, how's the baby? How are you? Made her feel so much more at ease. So it wasn't anything really that big. And made her, I think, feel that she could actually have more of she has a relationship with her child's teacher, as opposed to not having one in the previous school.
Yeah, and I just thought that small phrase, you can feel it, it really made me reflect on from an educator's point of view, and for my time as an educator, it's not just what you do, but it's how you do it. And you can ask those questions and actually not really be appearing as engaged and as interested as you could be, but it's about really being present for that mum in that moment when you're speaking to them, isn't it?
Yeah. It's usually the simple solutions.
Yes, exactly. It really is. The other thing that I was really interested in that Mum C had said, going back a bit to that sort of understanding what her child is doing in school and therefore what can she do at home to help, was the bit about lockdown. We've chatted before about the sort of unexpected things that come up, and the bit that Mum C said about lockdown and how that helped her to really see what was going on in the classroom.
That was really interesting, because I know it's been a huge challenge for the teachers and parents at every single level of the education system. But there is a silver lining sometimes, and that's what we found with Mum C, where she was saying, if I summarize it, that during the lockdown she could actually watch. Here we are. During lockdown 1, they were having classes for reception on literacy for half an hour, then a break, then story time, then a longer break, then half an hour numeracy. I found it helpful because I could see how they were teaching him. It was just the right amount, and I got to understand how their method was. So it really kind of opened up her window, I suppose, open the door.
Open the door.
Ironically, yes, even though it was online and with all the sort of issues about children's concentration and interaction and all of that, and engaging them, there is actually this opening that happens where the parents then in the classroom or in the setting, and things like picking up the language, the nuance, the style of even one way of questioning, that's a huge win for a parent, to feel a bit more empowered and feel that they can partner with the education provider rather than be this separate trying to do things differently. So that's just a win-win, because the one who benefits is the little child.
Yeah, absolutely. It made me think as well about, because Mum C and the other mums actually were kind of talking about how much communication in terms of their child's learning and what their child was doing they were getting from the school. And I just wondered, Suma, is it partly about the fact that there wasn't or isn't very much communication, and or is it partly to do with how that communication is kind of sent out there? What platform, what methods are used? Is it one or the other, or a bit of both?
I think it's got really blurred with the pandemic, home learning and then going in. So the mothers I spoke to did differentiate between before the pandemic, when life was normal. And if we look at it from that perspective first, I think the platform really does matter, because we had a fair amount of discussion about too many emails and not understanding where the important bit of information is, or having an online journal, which can be a great resource, that was interesting from Mum A, depending on how it's used. So in the nursery, where she didn't realise when information was being uploaded, she might have logged in once in 3 months and found really old information and pictures. The same online journal was very helpful in reception, because the teachers were saying, check it this week for this, check it this week for this, so Yes, it's a really hard one to answer as well, because it's, I think, again, we keep coming back to that word partnership. It's about how we're using the platforms we've got. Having said that, if I go to the other side of whether it's pandemic or not, coming back to Mum C, it's that face-to-face interaction.
Yeah.
It just seems to be nothing as valuable as that full human experience where you actually, even if it's for 2 minutes, making contact with your child's educator who they've been with, sometimes all day, because like real life, some nursery sessions are not just the afternoon or the morning. With parents who are working, it's a very long day that the children are there. And that 2 minutes or a minute of face-to-face is probably the most consistent feedback I got from all 3 mums, that's where they feel the confidence and they actually feel that they can ask something, or they feel that they've understood a bit more about their child, the progress.
And Mum C, kind of, her narrative sort of ended on her talking about the importance of communication.
Yes.
Didn't it? Suma, are you able to read out that last bit that Mum C said?
And it was interesting because our conversation moved on to mothers in her community. So now we're talking about Somali community. And she was saying, in relation to herself, because she's educated, she has further education, etc. She said it's difficult when mothers don't have that level of language, or they lack familiarity, or they're newer migrants. And then she was discussing, so to give it the context before I read it out. So she said, the main thing for me and other mums, especially the newer ones to this country, is communication. If there's a way to talk to mums about their children's learning, that will make all the difference. So many mums from my community don't really understand what their children are doing all day. But when the teacher shares, it helps a lot. When my son was going to reception, they talked a lot about big school, and so did I. And he was fine settling down after the first 2 weeks, sort of moving up to reception is what she was talking about. So yeah, sharing and we've talked before, Suma, haven't we, about that kind of concept of they don't have to be really big things that schools and educators and teachers and staff can do to support parental engagement, and that bit that Mum C says there, but when the teachers share, it helps a lot. As you say, it just sharing can be enough, in this particular situation. Definitely.
And I was going to ask you, Suma, as well, whether there were other things that don't need to be big things that schools can just think about. What are they doing, and how can they do things to help minority mums become and feel part of the community in one way or another?
I've seen some really good examples. Been fortunate to see them in action where they've actually used some mums' skills and interests. By mums, we're talking about the main carer as well. Because sometimes it's a grandmother or it's an uncle or father, but the main parent who's doing the engaging on coming, they've often got them involved, sometimes just from a conversation. Again, it starts small, where they've been able to find out, okay, they've got this language skill, or they've got this hobby or this interest, and got them into just maybe run once an after school thing. I've heard of gardening, I've heard of sewing, I've heard of a language club, different things like that. And then that's grown into bringing other parents on board. So then that would, if we narrow that down, that's parent to parent communication. So facilitating it, not necessarily having to do much as a teacher, apart from maybe just facilitating the idea. Because we know that teaching staff have more than enough on their plate as it is. And can be a real challenge to find time to do anything else beyond the amount that they're already doing. But yeah, parent to parent groups, clubs, PTAs, that kind of thing exists in theory, but it's getting those who are not that engaged to come on board. And that can often just be that one step of, would you help with this club, or would you like to come in and do this? And just asking one-to-one. Often what I found is that there are a lot of mothers willing and very keen, but they don't have the courage or the confidence or the know-how to put themselves forward. And it's that one ask, not always by teaching staff, it could be ancillary staff, sometimes supervisors, just somebody who makes that contact and says, how about this? Have you thought about this? And they'll be often very willing then, because they were asked.
Yeah.
I don't know what the psychology of that one is, but
I just know
from experience, 10, 20 years of hearing that, you start to realise there's something definitely encouraging about being asked rather than having to put yourself forward.
Yeah, it's so basically it starts with something as simple as an invitation, as inviting, which is such a simple thing, isn't it? That's not, from a teacher and an educator's point of view, that is not an overwhelming thing. You don't have to sort out a massive program of something. You don't, it's literally just, as you said, it's that one-to-one communication, and as simple as an invitation.
And I think we've come round full circle. So having really grown up kids as I have, I had them in school when it was pre-mobile phones, or we had just what they call the brick at that point, pre-WhatsApp for sure, pre-text, pre-all of that. And then everything was face-to-face. And I think just my personal observation that with so many platforms and so much information that everyone's receiving from this group, from that WhatsApp group, from, whether it's family, work, the neighborhood, even roads have got WhatsApp groups now, I'm hearing. Yes.
They have, haven't they?
Yeah, so all these links, do this survey, can you do that? Can you fill this in? Can you join this petition? Can you there's so much information overload that when it would strip all that away and come back to just basic school engagement, I think now it's more powerful to just have that face-to-face ask. Ask, suggest, invite, rather than the message and the emails.
And we've kind of come to the end of Mum C's narrative, and I just wondered if we could just kind of end this conversation talking about, you mentioned just then about how it can also be, the parent-to-parent contact is really important. And we were talking just before we started recording about that playground space. And Suma, I'm going to mention your book, which is Muslim Mothers and Their Children's Schooling. And in there you have a chapter on relationships, and you have a phrase in there, and there's almost a subtitle about playground pariah. And I just wanted to talk a little bit before we end about that kind of exhausting effort of fitting into that playground space, and the power of media messages that can make that so difficult, and how that can feed into then fitting into the school community, the school space, the learning space, or not. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's a big subject, isn't it, Jules? And a complicated one at that. But if we try to stick to the simplicity of early years and putting our children in every day and picking them up again every day, I think it's just having that awareness as educators that there is this very tangible domino effect that goes on when there are atrocities happen around the world, and they're reported, and that red breaking news comes up on the TV screen, that it has a direct impact on how people engage or not as parents one-to-one. And it can create divides. It can exacerbate little divides and make them bigger. But I think, again, it's just addressing it in whichever way. Every school's its own, and every nursery setting is its own world, isn't it? With its own dynamics, its own geography, location, demographics. So it's using what we've got to work with, which is going to be different and look different for every setting, to actually address that in some way where you can't dictate who talks to who, but just having that awareness that sometimes you've got that really proactive parent who drops their children. And I've often suggested, how about like a low-key ambassador thing, where they are actually quite purposefully active in engaging other parents, just in that playground chat. So it's nothing that staff need to do, but just have that parent who is confident and who does like talking to other parents, to engage with maybe 1 or 2 parents a term or something of that sort. And that can then, where we started this part about kind of the negative domino effect, it can actually have a very positive ripple effect. Because when 1 or 2 parents start talking to somebody that they may not have before, that invitation we were talking about a few minutes ago to come into the school to do something, or the nursery class to support something, then becomes that bit more doable, a bit more of a reality. So yes, back to human interaction in whichever way a setting can manage it, but to just be aware that these things do play out. And sometimes it's hard to say, I don't know what to say about that event that's just happened.
Yeah.
And who do you say that to? But everybody's thinking things.
Yeah.
And even us just having this discussion, I think is useful. Just that is enough to raise the awareness that these things come into the playground. They're real.
Yeah.
Even if there's a silence around it.
Yeah. There was in your book, Suma, there's a mum who can I read a quote out from a mum? I think it was a mum called Bushra, and she says, and everything that is in the news comes out in the playground.
Yeah. And it's often in silences. That's the interesting thing too.
Right. Yeah. Yes, and they're not talking.
Yeah.
To each other.
They don't know what to say, and they don't know. They don't want to offend by asking, and people don't want to explain because they think that implicates their connection to events that they don't want to be connected to. So it is so complicated, and I wouldn't for a minute think that the playground's a place where this can be solved. It's way too big.
Yeah.
But I think awareness and our discussing it is part of a solution rather than perpetuating a problem.
Yes, and I think you're right, and I think that's so true, because I think in schools, it's really important, because it is part of the school. The playground space is part of the school. It's part of the school physically and emotionally and all of the other ways, socially. And so for, again, talking about the door, keeping that door open so that staff know that those feelings can be happening in the playground, and that that talking or not talking can be happening in the playground is really important, that they are aware of that, as you say, and that it's just not the other side of the door, but it's actually very much part of the space that everybody, as you say, is wanting the best for the children, because that's what that space is ultimately there for.
Yeah.
I think, Suma, that's probably a really lovely place, a really good place to end. Thank you so much for having another conversation with me today. It's been
thank you very much. It's been great to flesh out a few more points, and really enjoyed it. And thank you again, Jules.